الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد، أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we're going to be continuing the series of the miraculous nature of the Quran. In the previous video, we talked about, gave a little bit of introduction to the miraculous nature of the Quran. In today's video, inshallah, I want to highlight a couple of examples from Surah Al-Baqarah in the first juz. So the first verse that I want to talk about is Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 24. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا وَلَن تَفْعَلُوا فَاتَّقُوا النَّارَ الَّتِي وَقُودُهَا النَّاسُ وَالْحِجَارَةُ أُعِدَّتْ لِلْكَافِرِينَ. And this verse was revealed in reference to the verse before it, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala issues a challenge to all of humanity, saying that if you have any doubt in the Quran, then bring forth just one surah that is comparable to the miraculous nature of the Quran. And in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seals that challenge, where He says, if you are not able to do so, and you will not be able to do so, then fear the fire whose fuel is men and stones, prepared for the disbelievers. So when we analyze this ayah a little bit further, especially in the context of Arabia 1400 years ago, we have to realize that what they used predominantly for fire was wood. And in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the fuel of the fire will be people and stones. So at that time in Arabia, it's practically unheard of for stones to be used as a source of fire. But in today's day and age, if we analyze it with the perspective that we have today, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking the same thing, that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might be referencing in this situation is actually coal. As we know, coal is a combustible rock that can be used for generating fire, electricity, and energy. And actually, it's one of the biggest industries for fossil fuel production today. So the miracle is that, in a time where it was not even heard of for stone to be used as a form of fire production, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala predicted that, coal could actually be used, and we see that prediction coming to life today. And what's interesting is that, even to this modern, to present day today, Saudi Arabia still practically has no intrinsic coal production. They choose to import all of their coal for their energy use, and they rely on their natural oil reserves for energy production. So, that again highlights the fact that coal as a source of energy was practically unheard of 1400 years ago, but that was predicted in this verse by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during that time. So the next verse that I want to talk about is Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter number 2, verse number 74. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ثُمَّ قَسَتْ قُلُوبُكُم مِّن بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ فَهِيَ كَالْحِجَارَةِ أَوْ أَشَدُّ قَسْوَةً وَإِنَّ مِنَ الْحِجَارَةِ لَمَا يَتَفَجَّرُ مِنْهُ الْأَنْهَارُ وَإِنَّ مِنْهَا لَمَا يَشَّقَّقُ فَيَخْرُجُ مِنْهُ الْمَاءُ وَإِنَّ مِنْهَا لَمَا يَهْبِطُ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ وَمَا اللَّهُ بِغَافِلٍ عَمَّا تَعْمَلُونَ. So to give a little bit of context to this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the incident of the cow. And in the previous verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning that, one of His signs is that He was able to bring back, the dead to the living. So this verse directly follows it, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing Bani Israel, and He is saying that ثُمَّ قَسَتْ قُلُوبُكُم مِّن بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ فَهِيَ كَالْحِجَارَةِ أَوْ أَشَدُّ قَسْوَةً. That, after that, despite seeing the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bringing life from the dead, still their hearts hardened like rocks or even harder. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions 3 types of rocks following that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّ مِنَ الْحِجَارَةِ لَمَا يَتَفَجِّرُ مِنْهُ الْأَنْهَارُ. That there are some rocks from which rivers gush out. And the next type of rock, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, there are other rocks that crack and water comes out from them. And the last type is that the rocks that descend in the awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِنَّ مِنْهَا لَمَا يَهْبِطُ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ وَمَا اللَّهُ بِغَافِلٍ عَمَّا تَعْمَلُونَ. And Allah is not unaware of what you do. So let's explore a little bit about the properties of rocks and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might be alluding to in this verse. So it's common knowledge in today's day in society that rocks are actually a reservoir, meaning that rocks actually have enough space inside of them, porous rocks to be more specific, that they can hold gas and liquid inside of them. So, at that time, this was practically unknown to the society that rocks are actually something that can hold water. Rocks were seen as something very solid, something that were not hollow, something that were completely solid from within. So the fact that now we know that rocks have the ability to store fluids inside of their pores, once again highlights that 1400 years ago, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran that there are rocks that water can actually gush out from within them. And another unique property of water is that we know that when water freezes, it actually expands. So if you have water inside of a rock and it actually gets to freezing temperature, that water will start to expand as it freezes. And as that happens, the pressure inside of the rock will build up so much that this can actually cause cracks inside of the rock. And we see this in our concrete and on our paved roads in society today, that during the winter time we see a lot of cracks in the rocks, and this is actually due to the water inside of them expanding, causing immense pressure, and that actually causes the rocks to crack. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that وَإِنَّ مِنَ الْحِجَارَةِ لَمَا يَتَفَجِّرُ مِنْهُ الْأَنْهَارُ, that there are rocks from which water can gush out of, and that there are rocks from which that cracks form from within them. We know that this is due to the intrinsic nature of the water that's inside of them. And this, subhanAllah, was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Arabs 1400 years ago. And we now know that that is actually true today from scientific discoveries. So aside from the literal meaning, there's actually a very interesting parable that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in this verse. So he starts off by saying that the hearts of the children of Israel, they became so hardened even after seeing the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, bringing the life back from the dead. So after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes on and mentions three types of rocks that we mentioned before. The first being that those in which water gushes out from. The second being that those which are cracked and water comes out from those cracks. And the third being that those that descend in awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the parable here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he mentions these rocks, he's actually talking about three different types of hearts. And we can analyze what these different rocks and how they correlate with the three different types of hearts and what that actually means. So the first example, the rocks that water flows out and gushes out from, this is actually in reference to a heart that has a lot of iman and a lot of khushu and a lot of taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in that as soon as this person or this heart, hears the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hears, ponders upon the ayat and sees around him the beauty and whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided for him, he becomes so humbled and so in awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that immediately tears begin to flow from his eyes. And this is a heart that's very soft and has a lot of iman inside of it. For example, we can look at Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. This was an example of this type of heart. He was someone who was so humble, so conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whenever he would hear any type of remembrance, it would immediately remind him that the reality of this life, and it would cause tears to flow from his eyes. That's how humble and how soft his heart was. In the next example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions hearts that are cracked, and from within those cracks, water begins to flow. So the actual the parable that's being mentioned here is that someone who may have been going along in their life, not really paying attention to what's going on, not really conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but something happens in their life that causes a crack, something really opens up their eyes and cracks open their heart. For example, a loss of a loved one, or some type of calamity. And that really refocuses their iman and allows them to gain that closeness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that crack actually is what causes the water to come out. And the water in this parable actually represents iman. So in the first example, like we mentioned, the heart is so full of iman that water just completely gushes out. And the second example, the crack is what actually causes the water to come out. And we can think of another sahabi to correlate this example with. We can actually think of Umar radiallahu anhu. So he was someone who, for the first years of Islam being revealed, he was someone who didn't really pay attention to or outright kind of rejected the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But when he, had that event where he went to his sister's house and he actually, raised his fist at his sister, that caused a kind of a crack inside of his heart, thinking that what am I actually doing? And that caused him to actually focus on what the message was being said, and that actually caused him to embrace Islam, and that was something that allowed for iman to be filled inside of his heart. And in the third example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِنَّ مِنْهَا لَمَا يَهْبِطُ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ, that there are those rocks that descend in the awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a natural example that we can think of is rocks that are crashing down in a landslide or things of that nature. And in this example, there's actually no water. These are just rocks. So this is an example of a person who intellectually he understands the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he accepts those signs, but there's actually no true iman within that person's heart. He's kind of just going with the motions, given the correlation with the example that there's no water mentioned. This is just rocks that descend in the awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are three types of examples of rocks, more specifically three types of examples of hearts that are mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To summarize, the first is the heart that is so in touch with the reality of Islam and the reality of this world that whenever he hears the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the tears start to flow out and he's so humbled. And this is an example of a rock that the water just gushes out of completely. The second type is those people who had to have something traumatic happen in their life that causes some type of crack from which iman flows. And the third type is that those are the people who intellectually in their minds they understand the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they don't really internalize it in their hearts. And all three of these hearts are examples of people who have hope. The first example, that's something that we aspire towards. The second example, even if something bad happens, we should use that as a sign to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the third example, this person has iman, but they need to work on actually internalizing it. They understand it from an intellectual standpoint, but they have to internalize it and bring that actually into their hearts. And the fourth example is those whose hearts are so hardened that despite them seeing firsthand the sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example in the Bani Israel, bringing life back from the dead, still their hearts are so hardened that it doesn't allow iman to even penetrate even a little bit inside of their hearts. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He protect us from being amongst those people, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He allow us to be in the first type of example where our iman is so strong that whenever we hear the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we see the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it allows us to completely be humbled by it and to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to have that taqwa and that iman sincerely in our hearts. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.